Let's take a look at Frederick Douglass's Learning to Read. This is our first official reading assignment, and you'll find this in the Norton Reader. I have it here linked up, and you can see it on the right-hand corner of the page that it appears on page 365. So you can open up any page of the Norton Reader, and in this corner, just type in the number 365. It should take you right to this page. You can also navigate by clicking on the table of contents, and you can see all the titles of the different assignments that way. But probably just by page number is the easiest way to get to a particular article. So this is Frederick Douglass over here in the right-hand corner. I wanted to share a picture of Douglass because he is such a formidable and amazing person in American history and American letters. He was born into slavery. He never knew his mother, barely knew his father, who happened to also be his owner, which is one of the tragedies and horrors of slavery. Just, the way that bodies and people were treated not like humans, but like chattel or like animals, or even sometimes not as well as animals. So in spite of all the odds, Frederick Douglass taught himself to learn to read. And he did that as a child by scrambling and convincing white children in town to maybe trade a piece of bread for learning and teaching him letters. And so he describes that in this piece. It's really fascinating. It really makes you appreciate things that sometimes we take for granted, like school and just our right to be able to learn legally. One thing to know also is that slaves were not allowed to read and write. And if they were caught doing that, they would be punished or beaten or whipped, sometimes even killed, because it was seen as a threat, obviously, to the power structure. All right, so he eventually grew up and became a free man and went on to write a few books and became a very well-known orator or speaker, and he fought for social justice in his time. And now we have his very powerful words. Let's take a look at the first paragraph. I just want to point out a couple things about his writing style, and hopefully that's going to get you started and a little bit more interested in what he's talking about. He says, I lived in Master Hugh's family about 7 years. During this time, I succeeded in learning to read and write. In accomplishing this, I was compelled to resort to various stratagems. I had no regular teacher. My mistress, who had kindly commenced to instruct me, had, in compliance with the advice and direction of her husband, not only ceased to instruct, but had set her face against my being instructed by anyone else. It is due, however, to my mistress to say of her that she did not adopt this course of treatment immediately. She at first lacked the depravity indispensable to shutting me up in mental darkness. It was at least necessary for her to have some training in the exercise of irresponsible power, to make her equal to the task of treating me as though I were a brute. My mistress was, as I have said, a kind and tender-hearted woman, and in the simplicity of her soul she commenced, when I first went to live with her, to treat me as she supposed one human being ought to treat another. In entering upon the duties of a slave-holder, she did not seem to perceive that I sustained to her the relation of mere chattel, and that for her to treat me as a human being was not only wrong, but dangerously so. Slavery proved as injurious to her as it did to me. All right, I'll stop there. Let's notice a couple things about the language here. I'm going to also highlight that last sentence. So in your Norton Reader, you can also highlight and take a few notes if you need to. So just remember that you have that option, and then you can always go back to it. Okay, let me come back to that part, and I'll highlight it in a moment. But I want you to notice that the language is elevated. So some of the words sound very formal You'll notice that he says things like compelled to resort to various stratagems. Nowadays, we might just say, I had to scramble around, or I had to, I felt like I had to sneak around, or I had to strategize. But keep in mind that he's writing to an audience of mostly white people who don't believe that Black or African Americans are capable of writing, or they're capable of argument, and that they're intellectually inferior. So in using this kind of language, he's also trying to prove to his mostly white audience that he's not only capable of advanced and deep thinking, but he might even be superior in that way. So it's very important for him to use language that is complex and specific. And so in certain moments, he writes in a little bit more of a relaxed style, but you'll notice sometimes that the language seems to be very formal, and that's true. And that's for a reason. Rhetorically, his purpose is to persuade people that slavery is wrong. And in using language, he's able to start to do that. Let's continue and look at a couple other things. He refers to the woman who technically owned him as his mistress. So you'll notice certain language here that, the man would be called his master and the woman would be called his mistress. So it's just another way of describing that power structure. So in this passage, we're learning that his mistress at first started to teach him, and she seemed, like he said, a kind and tender-hearted person. And she treated him like he was a human being. And so it's also important to know that many enslaved people were sold often in their lifetime, sometimes 10, 20 times, and they would have to go from plantation to plantation, sometimes being ripped away from their family, and they would then have a new master, a new mistress with different rules. And so he had just been sent to live with this new family, and she's at first nice to him, and then after that, it sounds like her husband says, no, you can't teach him, that's wrong. And then she becomes even more brutal than the husband. So it's part of the system of slavery that he's talking about, that it makes people terrible when it comes to just recognizing others' humanity. He says she at first lacked the depravity indispensable to shutting me up in mental darkness. So at first she believed that learning was good, and then she changed. It also says he also says it was at least necessary for her to have some training in the exercise of irresponsible power to make her equal to the task of treating me as though I were a brute. My mistress was, as I have said, a kind and tender-hearted woman, and in the simplicity of her soul she commenced, when I first went to live with her, to treat me as she supposed one human ought to treat another. And then that's when we see that it changes. Then slavery proved as injurious to her as it did to me. So he's making a powerful argument that slavery was evil, not only for the slaves, but for the slave owners, in what it did just to, their karmic or, I guess, anti-Christian behavior, I guess you could call it. Okay, now this is just a way, what I'm doing here is I'm annotating. I'm just noticing specific things, especially about his mistress and how her behavior changed. Another thing you can notice, just as I won't go on too much longer, but I'll stop here. You can notice the way that Frederick Douglass also uses metaphors. So he's very good at using these powerful metaphors like mental darkness. So whenever we live in ignorance, many people have used the term darkness, And then we use the term light often to describe knowledge or enlightenment. So those symbols might be used throughout. So try to notice places where he's using those metaphors or symbols. Now the rest of the piece talks about how he taught himself how to learn, which is a fascinating process. It really shows his intelligence and his resolve. And then he goes on to talk about the future and how he, the more you know, sometimes the harder your life is, because the more then you despair about what your situation really is. So you may have heard the term before. Let me just see if I can pull up a note here. I was going to say, you may, let me put a little note here for you. I'm just going to type this out. You may have heard the term ignorance is bliss, right? To not know something is to live in this sort of fog of not necessarily happiness, but just oblivion. And once we learn something, we have the responsibility, right? So learning creates sometimes despair. We are now responsible to change that which we know is evil. And I think that's a lot of what his point is here. Once you are enlightened, what are you going to do? What responsibility is now resting on your shoulders that you need to pay it forward or do something better? Okay, pointing out, last thing, at the bottom of the page, you're always going to see an MLA citation. So in the future, when we write about something from the Norton Reader, I might ask you to cite your source at the end of your paper, and this is the correct citation that we'll usually put at the end of our papers. We're not going to need that for this week, but just so you know, this is here. And then there are always going to be questions at the bottom of the reading assignments, and I don't usually assign you to answer those questions, but you might want to just read them and try to answer them in your own head, just to clarify some of the thoughts that you're seeing and some of the points that the author is making. Okay, let me leave it here, and I hope you enjoy this reading. It's really important. A very famous American piece of work, or a piece of American literature, and I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you.